Let's go to the drum. All right, we're gonna get started. This is our new Wednesday format we're trying out. We're gonna sing a couple of songs, and then Daniel Lee is gonna give us instructions on how to do this thing. So good to see each of you. Good to have those of you who are streaming with us. It's always good to be with Christians and to worship. We're gonna start with "Pure in Heart, O God." Pure in heart, O God, thou me to be. May I devote my life wholly to thee. Watch thou my wayward feet, guide me with counsel sweet, pure in heart, help me to be pure in heart, O God, help me to be. Teach me to do thy will most lovingly. Be thou my friend and guide, let me with thee abide, pure in heart, help me to be pure in heart, O God, help me to be. That I thy holy face one day may see. Keep me from secret sin, rain down my soul within, pure in heart, help me to be. Lord, restorer and unseen, come and make your priesthood clean. Come refine our every part, purify us thought and heart. In our weakness and desire,
So in just a second, we're going to break out into classes. So here's kind of how this is going to work. We're going to have Bible study in here. The kids are going to have Bible class in the back until about 7:45. And we're going to all come back in here for just a few minutes. I'll have just a few words of encouragement, a time for prayer requests, for any type of encouragement somebody might need. We'll have that just briefly at the end. We'll have another song and a prayer. Song, prayer, song. Yeah. And then we'll be done. It'll be basically like we normally do on Wednesdays, just not the extended devotional time. So we're going to have prayer right now, and then the kids and the teachers are going to go back and have their classes, and then we will stick around in here and study for a little bit. So you guys pray with me real quick, and then we'll let the kiddos go. Father, we thank you for your goodness. We thank you for this rain that you've sent our way. We're grateful, Father, that you've allowed us to get here safely, to be here during this time to study your word, to encourage one another. Pray, Father, that you help us to make the best use of this time together, and help us, Father, to know you better because of the time we spend together and because of the encouragement we receive from one another. Please bless us. In your Son, Jesus Christ's name we pray. Amen. All right, kiddos and teachers, migrate to the back. Test, can you guys hear me? You guys can hear me? Hey. Got a shake from the back row. The back row can hear me. That's important. Well, how's everybody doing this evening? Small crowd. But it's a good crowd. Yeah? Got a thumbs up? So, this Wednesday starts a new quarter. And this quarter we're going to be studying the Bible reading. I know I've talked to some of you guys about the Bible reading that we've been doing. And I've had several people comment to me about how we don't really have an opportunity to talk about it. It's easy to fall off, not keep up with the Bible reading if you have nobody to talk to about it. And really the goal of the Bible reading is to have something that we read collectively and that we have in common that we can talk about. And it doesn't really do us any good if we don't have a chance to talk about it. So the goal of this class on Wednesdays, obviously I'm up here teaching, but I want us to be able to discuss the Bible reading. I have found the wisdom literature that we're reading right now to be incredibly valuable. I hope you have too. And most of the time the excerpts are not very long. It's mostly just a chapter a day. But that's the goal of this class. So every week we'll just be discussing whatever the Bible reading is so you can prepare for class by having that done. I may or may not send some questions out. I've been toying with the idea of getting some other people to help teach this class just to get some different perspectives, because ultimately my goal with this class is that we can help each other better understand the wisdom literature. That's the goal, and I want to hear what you guys are seeing as we read through this, because it's just, to me, it's been fascinating, especially when we get into the classes where we're studying from the Proverbs, because you guys know every proverb is a whole lesson in and of itself, and I mean, I could spend a whole lesson talking about, the tongue, or talking about a relationship that it describes, and maybe you've read something completely different. So let's use this time for that. That's my goal and all that. Having said that, for the next 2 weeks, our Bible reading is in the book of Job, which is a bit of a unique situation. Obviously, we're kind of dropping ourselves right in the middle of Job. And so my goal for class tonight is I'm going to really set the stage for next week, because we're going to get back into Job. But I want to give us some context for Job. And I want to do that by kind of putting it in contrast to some of the other wisdom literature. I don't know if you guys have noticed this. As we've studied through the wisdom books, they contain a lot of similar thoughts. There's a lot of similar information in the wisdom literature, but they're presented from different perspectives. And I guess what I mean by that is the Proverbs, for example. As you read through that, the Proverbs is really written from the ideal perspective, isn't it? The father is talking to his son, and he's not saying this is how it's going to be every single time, but he's telling his son, if you follow these principles, if you walk this way, this is the best way for you, and it will produce the best results. Whereas when you get to the book of Ecclesiastes, he takes more of a negative perspective on a lot of those same principles and realizes, yeah, life isn't always perfect, but these principles help us to live the best life possible. And then you get to the book of Job, which just kind of takes all those wisdom principles and it crunches them together, and Job basically says, we have no idea what we're doing, but God is trying to help us know which way is best. And so the way I look at Job is that it's a very practical, it's a very practical situation, right? I mean, Job is going through difficult times, and he's trying to apply the things that he knows about God and the things that he trusts about God in a very real and difficult and uncomfortable situation. And so, in my opinion, out of all the wisdom books, Job is probably by far the most challenging. Again, this is my opinion, because what I've seen as we've read through Job up to this point is both Job and his friends, they're acknowledging the sovereignty of God to bless and to curse humanity. They're discussing the implications of that power, and as they're looking at this disaster that Job is going through. I mean, he's lost most of his possessions, most of his servants, his house. He lost all of his kids, a devastating situation, and they're all looking at this going, what are we supposed to do with this? Why is this happening? Really, why is the big question in the book of Job? And so it becomes very difficult and very uncomfortable and very real, because I think we all get to these points in our life when in our faith, when applying our faith and trying to live for God, things don't line up. Things don't make sense, and life becomes difficult. And so just a couple of things I want to present to us as we read some from the book of Job tonight. Two things that I think we need to consider, that I've been thinking about as I read through the book of Job. The first is Job presents some very important theological truths about God. If you've been doing the Bible reading, you've probably seen some of these things. Job and his friends both make very definite statements about God. Here's who he is. Here's what God has done. Here's what God has promised. I was reading, in I think it was just a couple chapters, or chapter 26, which we'll reference a lot tonight. They say things like, he stretches out the north over the void. He hangs the earth on nothing. He binds up the waters in his thick clouds. They're all referring to the authorship, the creator element of who God is. And this, as they're talking about Job's situation, this really becomes if not the central point of discussion between Job and his friends. You might have noticed this. As they're going back and forth, they both make statements about, well, we know that God is this, and we know that this is how God behaves. We know that God does not honor the unrighteous person. They make very definite statements, and so that becomes the central point of discussion as they consider the present circumstance. They're trying to frame it in the context of what they know about God. And so as you read through Job, there's a lot to learn about God. But we also must consider, as we're reading through Job, the difference between human judgment and God's revealed truth. And this is really what's been very enlightening to me as I've read through Job this go-around. At the beginning of Job, we're told Job is a righteous person, right? And we see God's commendation. He's talking to Satan and he says, have you considered my servant Job? And then you get to the end of the book, and God comes back and he says, Job has spoken rightly about me in every point, Job 42 and verse number 7. And so there's this guiding framework of Job is righteous, and Job is speaking of God truly. And so everything that Job says, at least in my opinion, this is how I'm perceiving it. I'm open to your opinions about this. But as I'm reading the book of Job, everything that Job says is what I'm trying to conform myself to. Whereas his friends, as God will say in Job 42 and verse number 7, he'll say, these friends of yours, they've not spoken rightly about me. And so every time his friends speak, we have to realize that there's something fundamentally improper about what they're saying. Now, I don't say that to say everything that they say is wrong. I think, again, there are some definite truths that we learn, but there's a difference between what God has revealed and what they can know and human judgment about it. And I think this is really where the paths begin to divide, and we need to understand who God approves and who God does not approve. And like I said, you kind of have to read all the way through the book to get that understanding. because that says it at the front end and the back end of the book. But this really becomes critical to how we read, because Job's friends, again, if you've been doing the Bible reading and you've been reading through Job, Job's friends make some arguments that we may agree with. In fact, I was listening to Job's friends talk, and I thought, I've given that counsel to somebody before. There are times when Job's friends, they're looking at it and they're saying, listen, man, we know God doesn't bless the wicked person, and based on your circumstances, you sound like you're being too proud, and you need to bring yourself down a couple notches. They make comments like that. Obviously, that's the Daniel Lee paraphrase, right? My Bible doesn't actually say it like that. But they're trying to bring him down a couple notches because they're looking at him like he's an egomaniac. Like, hey, you need to calm down with how you're talking about yourself, how you're talking about God. I've found myself on more than one occasion listening to Job's friends talk and thinking, yeah, that's a pretty good argument. If life isn't working out, or if things aren't going like you should, maybe you ought to consider that you need to change something. I know I've given other people that advice. And but what I'm coming to realize, and I'm trying to be very cautious about this, in my understanding, the fault that we find in their arguments as they're talking to Job is not what they believe about God, but rather their assertions based on what they believe. They look at Job and they say, here's what we know about God, and because God is this way, this is what He's doing to you. And they're passing judgment in a way on Job and telling him this is what God is doing, as if they know all the workings of God. And of course, at the beginning of Job, we know God's not punishing Job. God is testing Job. But they don't know that, and they keep asserting that. And so it's when they start trying to explain why events are happening to Job that they begin to cross a line that God is very unhappy with. In fact, I'll just read these verses to you. At the end of Job, verse number 42, as God is kind of giving His final say about what has gone on between Job and his friends. And it says, verse number 7, after the Lord had spoken these words to Job, the Lord said to Eliphaz the Temanite, my anger burns against you. So Eliphaz is one of the friends. My anger burns against you and against your two friends, for you have not spoken of me what is right, as my servant Job has. And so God's not real happy. In fact, He tells him, you need to go have Job pray for you, because Job is righteous. You need to have him go pray for you, and you need to go offer some sacrifices and get right with me, because you are not thinking properly. And so anytime that we're reading through Job, we need to think about it in those two, in kind of that dichotomy. Job is speaking rightly about God, whereas his friends are not. And so, something that I've learned, and I realize, again, I'm kind of dropping us here in the middle of Job. I'm hoping to lay some foundational work for next week. Something I've learned from my study of Job this time is that, we often contextualize and rationalize God's sovereignty in natural terms. And what I mean by that is we look at God and we say, well, if God is this, then naturally this is what follows, right? That's the law of nature. Every action has an equal or opposite reaction, right? That's a law of nature. Is that right? Am I getting that right from science class? No? No teachers in here. I can just make that up. That's a law. I read about it in a book one time. And I just say that to say that's simply not the case with God. There is not a direct reaction. If we do something, we can't just expect that God will do the same thing every time. Now, He does sometimes. The righteous will prosper, the wicked will be punished. God has promised those things, but it's not always immediate. And that's kind of what we see playing out in the book of Job. And that's really where Job finds himself. And his friends take this position that because suffering exists, Job did something wrong. And that's a faulty understanding of what God is doing in Job's life. But that's really what they keep pressing at Job. You have done something, and therefore God is responding to that. God is punishing you. You have received His wrath. And the reality is, I wrote a blog about this about a month ago. The reality is nobody really knows what God is up to. And I've become very cautious based on what I've read in Job about asserting judgment or passing judgment on other people because of what I've read here. Because it seems to me that God is not happy with Job's friends, and a lot of it is because they are trying to tell Job what God is up to. And God comes back at the end of Job and He says, nobody knows. That's my place. I'm not asking you to know everything. I'm asking you to fear me, to trust me, to put your hope in me. And that's what we're going to talk about a little bit more tonight. And so I want to start off there just kind of giving an admonition, something to think about. We have to learn not to assert judgment on other people. We might look at a situation and say, they're in a really bad position or situation, and we can look at X, Y, and Z that they've done, and we can say, well, they've done this, and so therefore, there's consequences. And maybe that's true in some cases, but we don't always know. We don't always know if God is using that situation or what God is doing in that situation. Jesus would say the rain falls on the just and the unjust. And so this is a principle that I think, again, permeates the wisdom literature. You remember in the book of Ecclesiastes, he looks out at the world and he says things like, I noticed that the things that the good people do, or it happens to the good people as should happen to the unrighteous people, but they're suffering when they should be blessed. And it doesn't make sense, and he talks about this as the vanity of life. But I say this kind of foundationally just to say ultimate understanding and judgment belong to God, who knows. He controls everything according to His timeline. And so as we read Job, we need to see that distinction between what can be known, what God has revealed, what we know with certainty, and what is human judgment. We need to not be quick to say, because God is this, then this, because we just don't know. And that's a step too far. Any comments, thoughts about that? For those of you especially that have been reading through Job, I hope this has kind of piqued your interest to read Job next week. I know some people are kind of getting off on their own Bible readings, but this will reel us back in. So that brings us to kind of our current Bible reading for this week. We're in the book of Job, chapter 27, and we'll read this. If you haven't had a chance to read it, we'll read it out loud. I'm just going to kind of get as far as I can through here because I'm not expecting to cover 5 chapters of Job tonight. There's just too much in here. But if we can get through chapter 27, I'll be happy. As we get into chapter 27, let me just give you a little bit of context here. So at this point in the story, Job's friends have given their final comments to him. There's kind of been this back and forth. One friend will speak. Job will come back and say, well, here are my thoughts. And that's gone on. Both friends have spoken 3 times. And at this point, Job is kind of giving his final discourses. But tensions are really high. I mean, imagine a conversation where where these 2 parties have very different opinions about something that is going on. Very different opinions. And they just cannot come to any sort of resolution, and they're just going back and forth. That's where we are in Job chapter 27. Job has adamantly, almost embarrassingly, refused to concede on any point to them. They've said, you see yourself as righteous, and Job says, that's right, I'm righteous. I mean, some of the things he says is pretty straightforward and pretty out there, things that I wouldn't feel comfortable saying. And so, like I said, his friends kind of see him as being an egomaniac. They've tried to bring him back down. And I think, I've kind of ragged on his friends for a minute. I think they have pure motives, my opinion. I think Job's friends really do have pure motives. They're trying to help him honor God. They're looking at him and they're saying, we want you to be in a right relationship with God. We want this suffering to end. They're trying to kind of talk him through his situation. So I think, their motives are in the right place. I mean, why else would they come and sit with him for 7 days? You remember that at the beginning of Job? They come and they see him and he's in bad shape. So they literally just sit on the ground with him for 7 days. So, I mean, to me, that says something about his friends. They care about Job. They want what's best for him. Of course, if you just listen to some of the things they say about him, you might not get that understanding. But their understanding of God, their faith in God, really, it should have developed greater humility, greater mercy for Job. Instead of their unhelpful comments. In fact, listen to what Job says in Job chapter 26, beginning in verse number 1, as he's making his final comments to them. He says kind of sarcastically, how you have helped him who has no power. How you have saved the arm that has no strength. How you have counseled him who has no knowledge and plentifully declared sound knowledge. You can just hear Job's frustration. He's like, you guys are my friends and y'all are pummeling me and telling me that I'm in the wrong. And again, I think there's a really powerful message there for us when we're trying to counsel and trying to help people. And I don't think the problem, as Job's friends are talking to him, they're very direct. I don't think the problem was that they spoke directly with him. I think the problem was, as they looked at Job, they're trying to solve his problems. They're trying to say, we know exactly what you need to do to get out of this situation. And they really just, they don't know. In fact, it probably would have just been better if they'd have just sat there in silence with him, in my opinion. But this interaction is given to us to help us understand really more deeply about Job's relationship with God. And it's interesting, he makes this very cutting remark about their efforts to console by speaking of the contrasting nature of God. In fact, at the end of chapter 26 there, he talks about all the things that God has done. He's hung the world on nothing. The pillars of the heavens tremble. By His power He stilled the sea. He's done all these things. And then this really powerful verse, number 14, says, "Behold, these are just the outskirts of His ways. And how small a whisper do we hear of Him." You can almost hear Job saying, you guys have said a lot of words, and you have no idea what you're saying. But God, who knows everything, who created everything, He speaks to us in just a whisper. It's a very interesting contrast that you've got the Creator of the world who knows all and sees all and is in all, and He reveals very little, and He doesn't overstate things. And then you've got His friends here who are the created, who are speaking and speaking and speaking. I think this comment, to tie this into some of the other wisdom literature, it kind of exemplifies the wisdom of Proverbs 10, verse 19. When words are many, transgression is not lacking. That's what I thought of when I thought of Job's friends. So as we get into chapter 27, the interactions have really come to a climax, and Job just ceases to answer his friends. He's done talking to them, and he gives this discourse to tell us a little bit more about really his faith and what it's resting in and what he believes at this point. So let's read chapter 27 together, and we'll see how far we get here. Job 27, beginning in verse number 1, "And Job again took up his discourse and said, As God lives, who has taken away my right, and the Almighty who has made my soul bitter, as long as my breath is in me and the Spirit of God is in my nostrils, my lips will not speak falsehood, and my tongue will not utter deceit. Far be it from me to say that you are right. Till I die, I will not put away my integrity from me. I hold fast my righteousness and will not let it go. My heart does not reproach me for any of my days. Let my enemy be as the wicked, and let him who rises up against me be as the unrighteous. For what is the hope of the godless when God cuts him off, when He takes away his life? Will God hear him when distress comes upon him? Will he take delight in the Almighty? Will he call upon God at all times? I will teach you concerning the hand of God. What is with the Almighty I will not conceal. Behold, all of you have seen it yourselves. Why then have you become altogether vain? This is the portion of a wicked man with God, and the heritage that oppressors receive from the Almighty. If his children are multiplied, it's for the sword, and his descendants have not enough bread. Those who survive him the pestilence buries, and his widows do not weep. Though he heap up silver like dust and pile up clothing like clay, he may pile it up, but the righteous will wear it, and the innocent will divide the silver. He builds his house like a moth's, like a booth that a watchman makes. He goes to bed rich, but will do so no more. He opens his eyes and his wealth is gone. Terrors overtake him like a flood. In the night a whirlwind carries him off. The east wind lifts him up and he is gone. It sweeps him out. It hurls at him without pity. He flees from its power in headlong flight. It claps its hands at him and hisses at him from its place. So there's a very strong contrast here given between the godly person and the godless person. But before we dive into all that, I want you to notice the use of rhetorical questions in this section. So Job has done this actually throughout his discourses. And he does this in verse number 8 through 10. He says, "For what is the hope of the godless when God cuts him off, when God takes away his life?" So he's asking rhetorically, where's the hope of this person? Will God hear his cry when distress comes upon him? Will he take delight in the Almighty? Will he call upon God at all times? You see him asking these rhetorical questions that almost answer themselves. Why do you think Job is asking these questions? I mean, these are pretty important questions to consider, don't you think? What is the hope of the godless person? What do you think Job is trying to emphasize by asking these questions as part of his argument? Any thoughts? Okay, that he's not that person. Yeah, I agree with that. So I think these questions that he's asking, I mean, these are deeply profound questions that everyone has to answer, right? We need to be confronted with this. These questions need to be considered. If God is not for us, then what hope do we have? And the answer seems obvious, but I think Job asks these questions because they need a closer look. Because as I read this, the obvious difference centers around hope and the uncontrollable nature of life, right? That's kind of why Job has found himself here. He can't control what's going on. But he makes some very strong points here about God's sovereignty that I want to highlight this evening. He says, if God chooses to cut off this person, what can man do? Think about that. We need to back up and ask this question. If we believe that God exists, if we believe that God is an almighty creator, that He made us, that He has the power to speak things into existence, if that is our baseline, then if God chooses to set Himself against someone, who can do anything about that? That's a pretty scary thought, isn't it? If God chooses to set Himself against someone, can He do anything about it? I think that's Job's major argument here. He can't prevail against God. Even at his very best, he has no place. He has no way. God is God. God is sovereign. In fact, in Job chapter 9, he's already discussed this several times in the book, but I'll just read these verses to you because I think this helps emphasize the point. Job says in Job chapter 9 and verse number 3, if one wished to contend with God, one could not answer him once in 1,000 times. He is wise in heart. He is mighty in strength. Who has hardened himself against him and succeeded? It's impossible for both the righteous and the unrighteous. And he's really trying to draw that out and help us to understand. In fact, I think the New Testament puts this a little more clearly. If the righteous is scarcely saved, what will become of the wicked? I think that's what Job is trying to emphasize here. God's sovereignty is something that both the righteous and the godless ought to fear, ought to be afraid of. In fact, he drives towards this at the end of chapter 28, and we'll see that if we have time to get there. But his point is, no one can prevail against God, even at their very best. And whether or not God blesses, God gives, God takes away. You remember that from chapter 1? The Lord gives, the Lord takes away. Whether or not God does that, it's all His prerogative. We're just kind of in God's hands. I'm not trying to sound like a fire and brimstone preacher this evening, but these are some really sobering realities that Job is trying to bring us to and bring his friends to. And this is not to paint God in this negative, He toys with humanity type God. I don't think that's who God is. He reveals Himself as being good and merciful and working all things together for good. So that's not the picture I'm trying to paint. But God is creator. If we believe that, if He is creator, if He is almighty, that means He gets the final say in world events and in the way things play out in our lives. And so this kind of colors Job's question of what is the hope of the godless in a very different light. It's not about what you have physically that defines having hope. And I think he emphasizes this by intentionally painting this godless person, how one might be perceived as blessed. As we were reading here about the godless person. I mean, he talks about how this person has children. They have descendants. Did you notice that? Verses, let's see, this is verses 14, 15, 16. This godless person, they have children. He says, if his children are multiplied, it's for the sword. He talks about his descendants. He talks about having silver, having clothing. He piles this stuff up. He has a house. He has land. He has possessions. I mean, this person is, we might look at them and say, wow, they've got a lot of stuff. They're blessed, right? And that's kind of the argument of Job's friends. They're looking at Job and they said, you had a lot of things, but now it's taken away. So God surely can't be blessing you. You must be godless. And Job is saying that everybody has this stuff. The righteous and the wicked, the godless and the right person. But notice how he takes that picture of what the world might see as being blessed, and he twists it a little bit because he says, look at what happens to all this thing. Yeah, they have children, but those children are subjected to the sword. They don't have enough bread. The pestilence comes and kills them off. His widows, they're not sad for that. And he talks about their riches. He says, you're heaping up silver, but it's like dust. You pile up clothing, it's like clay. You start to see the futility. The things from Ecclesiastes start to color in between the lines here. The futility of gaining those things. What's the value? What's the value in having these things? Again, they're considered blessings. They're considered things that God gives to people. And I'm not saying God doesn't, but I'm saying if God were to take all of those things away, would you still feel blessed? I think that might be Job's argument because that's his situation. You think about that. He had everything. He was one of the richest men in the world, and now he has nothing. And his friends are saying, well, because you have nothing, then surely you've done something to anger God. God has changed because of something that you have done. But Job is emphasizing that it's not the physical that demonstrates blessedness, but it's hope. And ultimately, Job would say it's friendship with God that demonstrates his faithfulness to God. In fact, in chapter 29, we won't have time to get there, but Job reflects on his life before all these calamities, and he says, man, oh, that days were as they were in days of old when God watched over me, when he was with me, when the friendship of God was upon my tent. He said, when God was my friend, everything was good. Again, this is all wrapping up into the fact that God is sovereign, and God had made these choices to allow him to have what he had. And so then he asks the question, he says, this is what life looks like. So then what is the hope of the godless person? And I think the obvious implication from this rhetorical question is he has none, right? He has a reality that he lives in. It offers him no consolation from the inevitable corruption. If you take God out of the picture, life is vain, right? Ecclesiastes, that's what it's all about. You set off God to the side, you don't find fulfillment in pursuit of riches. You don't find fulfillment in pursuit of relationships or anything in this world. And that's what this godless person has. His hope is in what he can see. He is at the mercy of physical and psychological forces that plague his existence. I think that's what we see here in Job chapter 27. He says, verse number 20, terrors overtake him like a flood, and the night a whirlwind carries him off. It hurls him about with pity. He flees. Somebody who doesn't fear God, who doesn't trust God, that's it. I mean, they're subjected to whatever happens in this life. Their best efforts come to nothing, and even future generations that they try to plan for will be exposed to futility and corruption. I was thinking about this, how this applies today. I talk to people sometimes who, actually I was talking to a guy last week about, he was decrying how things were in our government and in our world, and he said, I'm trying to, I worked my whole life to set things up so that my family would have a better life when I'm gone, and I had such high hopes for our country that things would get better so that whenever I'm gone, my family can live in peace and all these things. But he's like, it looks like it's going down the drain, And I think that's exactly what happens. We can plan, we can try to establish a secure future for ourselves and for future generations, but we have no control over those things. And the person who doesn't hope in God, who doesn't trust in God, there is no security. As Job has been experiencing with all the things he lost in life, everything's been taken away from him. And yet he talks about the godless person as hopeless, because regardless of what that person does, nothing they gain, nothing they leave, nothing they profit is worth anything. So this is all very negative. Any thoughts, any comments as we're talking about this? I think Job is really trying to emphasize, like I said, God's sovereignty in both the lives of the righteous and the wicked. Go ahead. Is that a 5-minute? Or was that a... Okay, good. Good for you.
Well, I would just say on the flip side, as you're talking to people and evangelizing, you point out, the benefits of someone who has hope.
Sure.
You establish that life is finite, and in the end, it'll be over, and there's one or two things that will happen. And I know that's something I don't point out enough, but that's a fundamental teaching of the Bible. I mean, this life is going to end. There's one of two ways you're going to end up. what do you want to do?
Yeah.
So to me, that seems like a very clear and eye-opening thing to say to someone. But there's so many people without hope these days, and I think we have this amazing opportunity to show them what hope really looks like with Christian.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. In fact, it's been, as we've been studying through Ephesians, I've been thinking a lot about that, because that's really how the gospel works. The gospel always, you think about how Paul develops his argument in Romans. He gets us to this point in Romans chapter 3 where he says, everyone has sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. You're in a really bad place. Ephesians chapter 2, you were dead in your trespasses and sins. Gentiles, you were far off, but God. That's the gospel message. You have to see how bad off you are and how futile and how weak and how just worthless life is without God before you can appreciate that. And I think, to Daniel's point, we need to put in contrast everything that I'm saying with what Job says in chapter 27, verses 5 and 6, because, this is a pretty heavy situation for Job. He's been lamenting how terrible his circumstances are, but listen to what he says in verses 5 and 6. As he's talking to his friends, "Far be it from me to say that you are right. Till I die, I will not put away my integrity from me." Now, integrity is the thing that God approves Job of. In chapter 1, it's chapter 2, when God comes and he's talking to Satan, he says he has maintained his integrity, which means he's bending, but he's not breaking. You think about the integrity of a house or the integrity of a piece of wood. Its integrity is measured by how much it can take before it gives way and it breaks or it changes. Job says, "I have not put away my integrity from me. I hold fast my righteousness. I will not let it go. My heart does not reproach me for any of my days." His belief system, Job's belief system is fixed, is what he's trying to say, because he knows that his fate is far worse without trusting God. There's no hope. He believes that God exists, that he's made promises to humanity. And so all of his, as you listen to Job talk, all of his unwillingness to concede to his friends predicates on the fact that God is God. God is God. That what he says, what he has revealed, is true. And Job doesn't presume that his actions have made God do anything. In fact, Job, it's God's sovereign right to do as he pleases. And Job would say in Job chapter 6, "Have I any help when resource is driven from me?" As he's thinking about that, he says, "What do I do? If everything that I have, if it's taken away from me by God, what am I going to do? I can't compete with God." That's God's divine prerogative to do what he would want. And so, in other words, if God takes something away, what can I do about it? That's God's choice, and that's what we believe. We believe that God can do whatever he wants to do because he is our creator. Paul would say in Romans 9, in another way, he'd say, you're the clay. He's the potter. God has shaped you into this. Who are you to look at God and say, "Why have you made me this way? Why have you done this to me?" It's a difficult subject for us to, and frankly, we don't have enough time to consider it all the way through. But the point is that one does not dictate God. You and I don't dictate who God is or what God will do. God dictates us and reveals to us what we should know. In fact, the end of Job 28, he makes a similar statement to Ecclesiastes chapter 12. The end of the matter is this: to fear God, to keep his commandments. Because Job has realized that because God is God, he needs to just keep what he knows God has revealed to him. And again, as Job said, these are just the outskirts of God's ways, which is fascinating and kind of scary, because everything that's contained in this book is hard enough to learn it as it is. And Job is alluding to the fact this is the tip of the iceberg. We don't know anything about God. And so I think that, to me, that makes what we do have revealed so critically important to living properly. God's trying to enlighten us to how he thinks and the purpose for which we were created. And he's already determined these things. His plan for our hope and salvation is unchanged. And so Job is clinging to his integrity according to what he knows about righteousness. And I'll just wrap up with this verse. He says in Job chapter 13, verse 15, "This will be my salvation, that the godless shall not come before him." So he doesn't say, "This is my salvation, that God will restore everything that I've lost, that God will make everything better." He said, "This is my salvation, the godless will not stand before him." So he and the godless person may have the same plight in life, but when it comes down to it, because he trusts in God, he has salvation that guy doesn't have. I'd love to talk to you guys about this more. The sovereignty of God is really a very difficult topic, but one that this has significantly impressed me recently, and I think we need to consider it. So maybe we'll talk about this another time. For next week, we're going to study Job 32 through, well, we may come back and touch on some of this stuff because I think it's important to build the context. So be sure to read Job 32 for next week, Job 32 and 33, and we'll talk about that for our class next week. Sound good, you guys? All right. And maybe next week I'll send you some questions so I'm not talking the whole time. All right, we're going to get all the kiddos, and we'll go from there.
Clay, say the
Oh,
Father.
Same line. Obviously, it's a hard topic to talk about.
Pretty much summed it up to me.
I gave her ice cream.
All right, well, it's good to have everybody here tonight. I wanted to share with you guys a conversation that I had with somebody today, just kind of as an admonition and an encouragement. When you come together with Christians every week, you just kind of get used to and take for granted the fact that you have a community of people. And I realize I don't have super close relationships with everybody in here, but I know every week I get to see you guys, and I get to get hugs from you guys, I get to interact with y'all. I was talking to a guy today, and we were talking about a Jim Rohn quote. He's a motivational speaker. He says, "You're the sum of the 5 people you spend the most time with." And I said, "Yeah, that's true. That's a biblical principle. It's a great quote." And so I asked him. I said, "Who are your 5 people?" I was just kind of challenging him. And this guy, he doesn't have a church family. He doesn't. He's just coming to faith. And he said he was only able to list a couple people. And I just said, well, I didn't say anything. I just thought, man. What a sad existence to not have people that care about you, to not have people to come and be with, to not have a community. And that's the wisdom of God. That's what Ephesians 3 talks about. The wisdom of God is on display in the church because we come together as spiritual people and we encourage each other and we have this time together to help each other. And so that's really why we're here. We're here to be here for one another. And so we don't want to get together and not offer an invitation, not offer any time of encouragement. And so I know we're all here. We bring our stuff from the week. We're here to get rejuvenated, and I hope God's Word has lifted you up tonight. But if you have something specific, a prayer request or some sort of specific encouragement or some way that you need to respond to God's gospel or God's invitation, we want to offer that opportunity right now. I'm going to be standing here at the front. Tim's going to lead us in a song, and so we'll have the invitation at this time. And if you need some prayers or some encouragement, come talk to me while we stand up. Let's stand up and we'll sing this song together.
I hear thy welcome voice, that calls me, Lord, to thee, for cleansing in thy precious blood, that flowed on Calvary. I am coming, Lord, coming now to thee. Wash me, cleanse me in the blood that flowed on Calvary. Though coming weak and blind, thou dost my strength assure. Thou dost my boundless fully cleanse, till spotless all and pure. I am coming, Lord, calls me on to perfect faith and love, so perfect hope and peace and trust for earth and heaven above. I am coming, Lord, coming now to thee. Wash me, cleanse me in the blood that flowed on Calvary.
Glad everybody could be here tonight. We're going to have a closing prayer, and then we're going to have a closing song. I'm not sure who has our closing prayer.
John, he's up here.
It's not here. TJ's going to lead our closing prayer, and then we'll have a closing song.
Our Father in heaven, we thank you for this day in which you've blessed us with, for this week in which we've had the opportunity to do your will. We thank you, Lord, for the food that you've given us to eat, the clothes to wear, and the shelter which we live in. We thank you, Lord, for all that we have physically, spiritually. We ask and pray that you be with those who are not with us, those who might be ailing physically, spiritually, or even mentally, Lord. Lord, we love you, Lord, with all of our heart, soul, mind, and spirit. We ask and pray, Lord, that you guide us through the rest of this week. Help us to live each day to you. Help us to read your word daily and apply it to our lives. For we love you, Lord, with all of our heart, soul, and mind, and we love our neighbor as ourselves. Help us to look at the Bible in this way. Forgive us of our trespasses, Lord, and lead us through the path of life. In Christ's name we pray. Amen.
Oh, I have decided to follow Jesus. I have decided to follow Jesus. I have decided to follow Jesus. No turning back, no turning back. The world behind me, the cross before me. The world behind me, the cross before me. The world behind me, the cross before me. No turning back, no turning back.
That would make sense.